Economic Development Task Force to get in session for July the 15th, and recognize that we are holding this meeting on the traditional territory of the Snail First Nation. And before we start, I'm not sure if this is a warning or advice, but if this meeting will be video recorded and published on the City of Nanaimo website. So I guess I have to be careful what I say. Do we have any introduction of late items? No, none. Thank you. So can we have a motion to adopt the agenda as circulated?
So moved.
Thank you, Zenny. Seconded Bob Moss. And you all received a copy of the minutes.
All those in favor?
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, got to do that too. Next item is the adoption of the minutes from the last meeting held on June the 23rd. I'm assuming everybody got a copy of it.
Yeah.
Can I have a motion to accept the circulated, please?
So moved.
Is there any? Seconder, Bob. Any discussion, errors, or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried. And I'm just going to check up on the list here. I'm making notes of who's on the screen so I can. So we've got Andre is up there, and the gentleman next to Andre can.
Kim.
Sorry.
Kim Smythe.
My eyesight's really challenged here. Okay, I think I got everybody. So at this point in time, we will turn the meeting over to, actually Bill Corson is going to introduce Alan Nielsen.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be very brief.
Thank you.
So we have Alan Nielsen here again. Appreciate Alan coming to talk to us about the charter. This is a continuation of our discussion from the last meeting, and I'll hand it over to Alan, and hopefully we'll be in a position to take this to the next step after this.
Just before we go there, sorry to interrupt, but at some point in time I'm going to need to know how we're going to communicate as far as people wanting to ask questions and contribute when they're on Zoom. Do we have the little blue hand opportunity or just wave? Right.
Alyssa, how are you dealing with the people when they put their hands up? Are you checking them from Zoom? Okay.
Okay, so for those who are on Zoom, if you just have a question, just kind of wave your hand and I'll try to check periodically. And if you don't think I'm looking at you and not acknowledge you, just keep waving.
The podcast may not get many questions today.
Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Not at all. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the task force for having me back to discuss the draft, or the revised version of the draft charter for the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. What we did since our last meeting, or what I did since our last meeting, was to go away and kind of review the notes that I had taken on the board and to discuss with staff just some of the changes that the task force had talked about, not all of which the task force kind of came to a conclusion on necessarily, but issues that were raised and the items that were brought to the attention of the group. And took that feedback and put it into a revised version of the document. As Councillor Markman had asked, I've kind of redlined it in a sense, as best I could at least. But what I thought I would do, Mr. Chair, if it's okay, is just begin by kind of directing the task force's attention to the cover memo. And perhaps it's easiest if I just go through and highlight a couple of the key points in here, because I think they will kind of bring us quickly to any outstanding issues that the task force may wish to make a decision on going forward. So with that introduction, Mr. Chair, I'll just start kind of with the memorandum. And the first point to kind of talk about is mandate. In our last meeting, the question was asked about mandate, and the suggestion was put forward that we include some kind of item to capture business retention and expansion in addition to the attraction of business and investment from outside of Nanaimo. As I've mentioned in here, that's completely within the task force's domain to make a recommendation to council on that point. I did want to point out, however, that we were pretty clear in the review that we were going to focus this one on business attraction and business and investment attraction, because we had a number of agencies in town already focused on the retention and expansion. So my only caution to the task force is that if you wanted to include that, that's fine, of course. However, just need to be careful to avoid duplicating efforts and so forth.
Councillor Turley.
Oh, I'm sorry. Carry on.
A quick question, and I'm sure the information is probably in there, but off the top of your head, do you know what agencies are actually supporting retention and growth?
Sure, and so, in the initial report on the service model review, there was a table which kind of set it out. So we've got, for example, Kim's Group, the Chamber of Commerce, we've got Community Futures, we've got, oh my goodness. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, which one was that? Innovation Island? Yeah.
Innovation Island.
And there's a number of different ones, about 5 or 6 that kind of focus more specifically on business retention and expansion. And again, the idea is not to say that that's off limits to the task force. It's just, or to the new corporation. It's just that often the success of a new agency is going to be somewhat dependent on a very focused mandate to do something very well, as opposed to doing everything maybe not as well. So that was the only caution I wanted to put forward.
Thank you.
Moving on, Mr. Chair, the next item is something I think which is probably going to be the topic of some discussion today. This is really the fundamental issue around ownership. By the way, as I go through these different topics, they are kind of going in sequence of where they come up in the draft charter. So when we look at shared ownership, the initial version of this document put forward the idea of sharing ownership. That is, having the city of Nanaimo as the primary shareholder, primary owner, but also providing the option, or providing in fact, more than the option, in fact, structuring it so that we would have additional owners as well. That, I've just noted in here, we've kept that assumption in this one. I don't think the task force came to a definitive conclusion last time in our discussions. So I've kept it in here for a couple of reasons. One is that it was put forward very strongly in the feedback for the service review model that was done. And so that was the key reason. And the second reason, I guess, was it was put in both to achieve some kind of buy-in, and then, as Andre had kind of highlighted at our last meeting, also to provide for some protection. I think, Bob, you made this point as well, to provide for some sustainability, as it were, for the agency should the city, as the primary owner, at some point decide that it wanted to change course. The agency would still be there. We would still have 5 players, or however many different owners are at the table engaged in that endeavor. So one body couldn't kill it, in other words, if I put it bluntly about it. The other issue then, if I may go on, and I've got some questions a little bit later for the task force to consider, Mr. Chair, just on some of these points. So I'll just keep marching through until I see somebody stopping me. Shareholders, with respect to the shareholders then, this is just more of a terminology change. So we had talked about members last time. I've put it back to shareholders just because I think it's a little bit clearer and is more consistent with provincial legislation as well. When we look at owners then, or the shareholders, it was raised, the question, the very logical question was raised in the last go-around as to whether or not the prospective or the potential shareholders identified in the document have been approached for their willingness to determine their willingness or their interest in buying shares and becoming a part owner. And I've noted that they have not been approached under this charter. They had been, or everybody had talked about it in the consultation with the various agencies. So it's not a new concept. It's just we haven't kind of approached them on this specific charter. And so if the task force chooses to endorse the shared ownership model and chooses to endorse a preliminary list, then the city's next step would be to approach those particular members. Sticking with shareholders and ownership then, when we look at classes of shares, we've kept with the idea of having 2 different classes of shares, Class B and Class A, or Class A and Class B. So Class A would be the city of Nanaimo solely, and Class B would be the other minority shareholders. The only real distinction with respect to Class A shares now deals with the whole authorization of borrowing. And what I've noted in the memorandum is that because the NPA, the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency, which, by the way, I just twigged me as I was going through my notes, is also the Nanaimo Port Authority. So when I say NPA, it's Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. Unless there's a bill due, then it's the Port Authority. Yeah. Anyway, back to the classes of shares. When we are looking at the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency, it is going to be primarily funded using public monies. And so as a control mechanism, what we've said is that the authorization of borrowing, the incursion of debt and liability by the agency should be signed off by the Class A shareholder. and not by the other minority shareholders, but by the Class A shareholders, which is accountable to the electors for the use of taxpayer funds. So we've put that in there as kind of really the only substantial issue that would be a sole decision for the city of Nanaimo was the only Class A shareholder. And all other issues of substance, Nanaimo would be kind of have a vote at the table, just as every other jurisdiction that is an owner would have a vote, or every other agency that's an owner would have a vote. Now, and we've also noted, one of the issues that came up last time, and people spoke quite strongly about, was the whole issue of dissolution. In the earlier draft, we also awarded the authority of the city to be able to dissolve the agency whenever it chose, and we've taken that out based on the feedback from the task force. Moving on, Mr. Chair, the Board of Directors, a couple of points here with respect to the Board of Directors. The first just kind of captures on page 2, the first time Board of Directors is mentioned, simply captures or reiterates, emphasizes, if you will, that this Nanaimo Prosperity Agency, as a corporation, is going to be different in terms of its decision-making authority than what we may be used to as a city committee or even a city commission. So I wanted just to kind of clarify or confirm everybody's understanding with respect to the fact that this body, the Board of Directors for this agency, would be a decision-making body, not a recommending body, a decision-making body, have considerable authority as well. And so that's just important to kind of keep in mind as we go through this. With respect to the composition of the board, then, what we heard last time at the task force is that we don't want to have 2 voting members from the city. I believe the task force had settled on the idea that there would be 1 voting member, and that member would likely be a senior staff person, and that a councillor or a council member would be assigned to that body in an ex officio capacity as a non-voting member as well. I believe that was the consensus of the task force. And I'm not sure that jives with kind of the city's normal approach on these things, and I'm not sure that it matters whether it jives with the city's normal approach on these things. But that was certainly the task force's consensus, I believe. When we look then at dispute resolution, that was another item that came up. Disputes at the board table are dealt with through votes of the board. Disputes among shareholders, and keep in mind the shareholders as the owners have very little influence over day-to-day operations, and are simply kind of receive reports and hold accountable the corporation. Disputes among shareholders, we talked last time about the need to include some kind of dispute resolution mechanism, so we've done that in the new version. Very simple. And then finally, the big piece I think that came out of our last discussion was the need for some kind of sunset. Not in the sense that let's wrap this up after a particular point in time, but instead let's commit to it for a particular point in time, after which we'll do a review, because we need that 5 years to kind of find our way, to find our feet, and to set out and do good things. And we can't kind of always, we can't be operating as if with this kind of sword of Damocles hanging over our head. Give us that 5 years. Everybody commits to giving it that 5 years. That's been addressed in the final page of the draft, of the new version of the draft charter. And in there, it talks about a bit of a mechanism for initiating that review and then for giving an exit ramp at that point to any member, any owner that wished to exit at that point. So, Mr. Chair, those are kind of the key points in there. I won't go through necessarily the text of the draft revised charter unless somebody wants me to. I did notice just in preparing for this meeting that I did omit a change that was raised at the end of the meeting. I apologize for that. I had kind of noted in there some monies under base funding for destination marketing, and it was pointed out quite rightly that was a misspoken on my part. So that will come out of the next draft, I assure you. But I do, Mr. Chair, have some questions, simply suggested questions that the task force could use to kind of have some discussion, but I'm happy to take your direction on that.
Yeah, they're the ones that are listed on page 3. Does anybody want to comments on any of these questions? A silent group today.
I think from our perspective, I think it would have to be more of a board to council type of discussion from the organization. If it goes into text like this, where you sort of answer the questions are fair, but for me, it's a board of directors decision.
So, sorry, Jason, I don't know if everybody heard you or not, but You're indicating that the list of questions here are more discussions once we get a board formed? Is that-
Yeah, so I would need to discuss any of this with our CEO. We probably need to have some discussions with our board before making any final decisions.
Oh, with your board?
With our board.
Okay, sorry. Fair enough. Anybody else have any desire to, yes, Cindy?
So, with the groups that are named here, that may or may not participate, depending on their board decisions, right? But I don't know, but has Community Futures been approached? Or,
They haven't. That's a very good question, and actually, it's one that I pose here for some discussion. So you've kind of hit on a key point there, Councilor Martin. They haven't been approached for this, and in fact, none of the groups formally have been approached.
right,
Which is the university.
yeah.
But Community Futures hasn't, and I don't, my only kind of explanation there is I tried very, kind of coming up with a preliminary list, recognizing that it's for the task force to recommend a list, but in putting together a preliminary list, what I looked at more were the kind of the major institutions in town that have the means, that have the ability to kind of purchase shares in other organizations, and that are typically seen as a key stakeholder in community-wide events and also in economic development. Community Futures arguably may kind of make that very arbitrary cut, but I'm not sure it would.
And the only reason I ask, because I used to be on the board
Okay.
for Community Futures, so I'm a little bit, and they're also, they're kind of undervalued, I think, in our community because there isn't a heightened awareness about the work they will do for attracting new businesses and or maintaining and growing, right? They'll do both. I don't know if they would be a fit, and I'm sorry that Jolene's not on. She is on the call. I don't know what they're funding, because it's federal funding, and whether or not, but I'm just saying, I don't know that they couldn't be a fit either, so.
And I will point out, because I think it's raised a very important point, in two parts. One is kind of, which agencies, if the task force wanted to recommend the shared ownership model, which agencies could be identified as potential owners for the city then to approach, as Jason suggested, the city approaching the different boards
Right.
and directors of those groups. But also the idea then of emphasizing or highlighting the importance of including a broad range of groups in decision-making through committees, for example. So it would be very important for Community Futures and a number of different other groups to be represented on committees of the Economic Development
Right.
Corporation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm struggling with your name.
Karen,
Karen, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a question regarding the board of directors, because, for example, I know that each of the organizations would appoint a person. So, for example, let's take the Nanaimo Airport Commission. If they were to designate the staff person, i.e. Dave Devanna, on the next page it talks about they can only be a maximum of 2 additional terms for a total of 6 years. So that could get a bit clunky if it's a staff person who's, say, the CAO, or in the case of the city staff person who's been earmarked.
Okay.
Typically with most organizations, they would put an elected representative in there and those rotate over time.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that
Well, that's
might be a bit clunky
Okay,
if a
that's a good
staff person's
point.
appointed.
Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe it's or alternatively, if so, I guess there's two options there. One option is to kind of focus on the elected official then in that role, as you mentioned, they'll rotate over time.
Yeah.
And another option is to kind of say, well, let's kind of appoint a particular position from the city. So Calgary Economic Development, for example, has the city manager on
Right.
there. But it's a really good point, and that's, yeah, I don't have more to offer on that at this point, but you've raised a key one.
If I could interject on, Kim, go ahead.
I think that we have to, if this is the intended work of the body of this thing, that we're going to need to talk to, you're going to need to approach those 5 organizations with a little bit more detail around the shared ownership idea, potential costs, especially looking at it on a 5-year basis, so that we can go to our boards, because this is going to be substantially outside of my of my purview, and just even guessing at a dollar amount. So I think the concept and the cost of shared ownership has to be presented fully so that we can get board direction. I think I heard Jason mention something like that too, and I would be in the same position. I couldn't move forward on supporting this without a discussion with my board.
Thanks, Ken. The one question I was going to bring up, because one of my fellow councillors asked me, is what about private corporations, whether they would have an ability to be a Class B shareholder? The example you used, of course, is Walmart is concerned is that it might be a conflict, that type of thing. And I quite honestly didn't have an answer for it, but I said I'd bring it up here. So that's something I don't know if you've got experience with.
Well, there's nothing legally that precludes them from purchasing shares, even in a local government corporation. That's something we can confirm with the ministry on this point. But I think you've raised more kind of a policy question, which is, do we want to have a particular private company with its fiduciary interests and so forth on a board that looks more broadly at economic development? That may be problematic, but the other thing is too, I think over time, the number of shareholders and the types of shareholders could evolve. So and in fact, speaking to both Jason and Kim's points, it may be the case that the task force decides to say, well, let's, our intent is that we broaden this at some point, but let's start with city ownership, and then in the first year the city will determine kind of which agencies to offer shares to.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
As you mentioned, maybe broadening on it, like you say, maybe it's sectoral subcommittees from the board, right? Maybe there's something after that to get to your question. Is there something beyond? And I think the subcommittee sectoral pieces. But I think could something like that be done through the agency once it's committed that way? The agency has some help in the development of that so that they're directly involved in how that's going to move forward rather than deciding that for them.
Just a point of order here. Can you on Zoom hear Jason okay or not? No, I didn't think you could. Any chance you could sit right there next? Sorry to be a pain.
Be next to the mic.
Yeah, then everybody can hear you.
That's what Jolene has.
What's that?
Jolene has her hand raised. No, Jolene has her hand, her little hand.
Jolene would like to ask a question.
Jolene.
Oh, Jolene, sorry. Oh, there's a little blue hand. There we go.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Jolene.
Thank you. So I guess one of my questions is when we start looking at, the class of shares and then the number of voting directors. If it's 9 voting directors, and I guess at some point, if you keep bringing on, if you have the ability to bring on additional shareholders, we need to increase the number of directors because each director who is a shareholder is allowed a vote. So there'll come a point where you'll have to take it from being 9 voting members to more voting members. And at what point will you hit a capacity as to the number of Class B shareholders and Class A shareholders?
It's a very good question, and it does kind of speak to this issue of how this evolves over time. What we've kind of noted in the revised version is that one of the items that all shareholders, Class A and B, would determine jointly is the kind of the welcoming or the introduction of new shareholders, or the change in the number of shareholders, and also the method of appointing and the composition of the board. So at that point, if it became unwieldy, if it became unsustainable in any way, we would expect the shareholders at that time to identify how they wanted to restructure the board.
Bob?
I have 2 questions and 1 comment, if I may, put them all together. Firstly, on the issue of the classes of shares, Alan, if we were happy with the way this organization starts out and we choose to expand it on a regional basis to include other municipalities, is it intended that they would also be Class A shareholders, or is that to be determined?
I think that would be to be determined. I think it would depend on how much funding they're putting in and what they're comfortable putting in on that sense. Yes, so the short answer is to be determined.
Okay. I mean, I'm hopeful that we can at least, as we structure it, keep that option open, because that would be the best outcome of all, is if we could make this into a regionally funded organization at the end of the day. And my second question, and I apologize because I haven't read your latest draft, on the exit ramp piece, does it contemplate any shareholder having to provide some notice, whether it be two?
It does.
It does, okay.
So what I've stated in the exit ramp, and actually before I go there, Bob, maybe I can just make one other point, if I could, just on the Class A shareholders. We could, the task force could put forward something, or the articles of incorporation, the shareholders agreement could be kind of set out to say that any municipality that comes in could be Class A if it wanted to. So when we look at some other corporations, for example, they'll say, you know, any new government that comes in becomes a Class A shareholder. Or that could simply be something to be determined. Let me just address the other question then with respect to the exit ramp in the clause. So on the last page, what it talks about in essence is it says, look, we need to have, and actually kind of working backwards through that section, it ends with, look, for clarity, no shareholder will exit within the first 5 years. But what it says is that at the end of the 5 years of operation, at the end of the fiscal year, that year 5, any shareholder may depart, may exit. However, in order to do so, two things must happen. One is that they must give 6 months' notice, and the other thing then is the shareholder must recognize that any support they've given through a different agreement to support a particular initiative or project that is separate from the base funding. Because we know, for example, that different organizations in the community, some of whom may be shareholders, some not, but if a shareholder organization has put money specifically into an initiative or a project, that continues on. That continues irrespective of whether they're renewed, as long as that agreement's in place. So we don't kind of cut the knees out. But I think, just getting back to the 5-year review then, what we anticipate here, or what is anticipated in the document, is that for the first 4 years, it's going along without review. In year 5, the city is charged under here with initiating a review of the agency, and kind of, and there's certain things that it would look at. That has to be done kind of within the first 6 months of the 5th year. Based on the outcomes of that review, then a member can serve notice that is going to leave at the end of that year. But the funding's in place for the 5 years, the funding's in place for that 5th year, nothing changes in terms of the commitment and activities for that 5 years.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense. It's a little, I kind of had to work through the gymnastics of that to figure out how to kind of make this work so that an agency that wished to leave, or a corporate, that a shareholder that wished to leave could do so at the end of year 5 without having approved a budget and committed funds for year 6, if you know what I mean.
And I guess the thought that goes through my mind and to the task force is 6 months is a relatively short period of time. Should we contemplate maybe making that a year? I know that messes with us.
No, but it's...
presumably the organization will want to find a replacement funder or participant for that, and it will take some time, as all things do. So I would throw that out for discussion. And the other piece, if I may, Jim.
I got one more.
I got one more? Okay, good. I just wanted to suggest that on the private corporation piece, and I think we did have this discussion earlier on, my personal belief is that's a pretty slippery slope, and we should really try and keep that to other committees or funding groups that might support the organization, but to have them included as shareholders, I think, as much as I can see some benefits, that I think it's still a slippery slope, and it could get us into trouble down the road.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Next, we have Kathy and then Jason. And welcome to Dave. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Perfect, yep.
Thank you. I've got two questions. And one is goes back to a detail way buried into the document, the other document, which is on the quorum, which I think you said is the majority of stakeholders present is a quorum. So if there's only 5 people came to a meeting, 3 of them, they've got a quorum? Or is it that of all the shareholders and of all the board of directors, that it's a simple majority of the whole board? I have some concerns if it's just 5 of the 9 who are in attendance and decisions could be made there that might impact a broader and not having that participation. So just a comment there. And then secondarily, I'm going down to the mandate, and I thank you for clarifying that the primary role is not on retention and expansion, that there are other agencies and organizations in the community that are doing that. But when I look at the mandate on your revised charter, the way it's written, I was always taught to always have order of magnitude. So the number 3 is to develop and directly educate, undertake initiatives aimed at retaining and expanding. I would put the other one, which is the primary function, which is to attract employers and investment and economic development first, or above that one. And then I would put in, because you have been very careful in your memo to say that it's not a primary function, it's more of a secondary or support role, somehow indicate that that's not a main priority of this group.
Good point.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Do you have any response?
No, just I think maybe I just very briefly on the first point that Kathy raised with respect to the quorum. It's a very good question, I think, and there's kind of pros and cons in both ways. And anticipating the worst, I think that Doug Blackhouse last time had made the sensible comment that sometimes we need to build these things anticipating the worst. And I have been in situations before where all parties had to be at the table in order for a vote to be done, and simply it was filibustered by one party not coming to the meeting. So it can be difficult, but it's a really good point. And when we get into, and maybe that's just, if I could, Mr. Chair, this is a good point just to kind of reiterate something which is in the memo, which is that this draft charter, even though we're getting into the details a little bit and some of these things, and to a high degree in some parts, it's kind of an intent document almost. It's the blueprint. When we get to the articles of incorporation, there we're going to spell out in great detail, and the lawyers will assist us with this, using the information from the Business Corporations Act, kind of what quorum is, all that kind of stuff. So it's a very important thing to raise, though, because we need to flag that. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Karen.
Just from a corporate officer perspective too, there's ways that one could accommodate that through, like just in running a local government, there are some bylaws that you can't put through unless they have 2/3 majority. So perhaps looking at financial matters or something, that is a way around it, saying, the business is simple majority, but anything like the big ticket items would be 2/3 or something.
Yeah.
Jason?
I just-
Bill, did you have something?
Andre is after Jason.
Andre, okay. You're next after Jason.
I think for me, I'm just curious, if the first, getting into the weeds, I guess, but if the first term is 5 years, I think there might be some interest to understand what following that might be of interest. Is it 2, 3? What would the longer term outlook be after that 5 years? I think maybe it's in the weeds at this point, I understand, but I think it's also important to understand what's the longevity of it.
Yeah.
Is it 3 after that? Is it 2? Is it 1? Is it 5 again? I think just having some concepts of how the long-term that might look
That's a really good point.
would be helpful.
Go ahead, Bill.
Just to follow up on that, I thought Jake made a pretty poignant comment at the end of the meeting where he said, if we're going to actually implement the strategy, and we know it's going to take 5 years, we better be committed to it for 5 years, because there's no point trying to do it for a year. Nothing's going to happen, right? And I thought that was a really good point, and I think I like the way Alan set up the 5 years so that we can actually have some progress, have some results. And I would think that if you're going to renew it, you're probably going to renew it for another 5 years. But that's the timeline it would take to do this, right? But it'll give the partners a chance to go, you know what, that didn't work for me. I don't want to do this anymore. Or, wow, that was great. Let's expand it and bring in some more partners. That now we've actually shown we're we're showing that we're very competent and we can get things done. Now more people want to join us. This is good. Let's expand our mandate.
Andre, you had your hand up, so you're next, or I don't see your hand there anymore, so, okay.
Thanks, Chair. That's great. I just wanted to comment that I do like the idea of shared structure. I think it's a good structure, and if we can get it there, then that's great. But the logistics of getting it there, with all partners, is great with the challenge to agree to the same contribution amounts and whatever. So there will be some logistics. So if the city has to start on its own and then bring in partners, I get that. But I'd also encourage whoever is doing that negotiation and discussion with partners to have some flexibility. There will be partners who can, like a VIU or a chamber, who may have some very relevant in-kind contributions they can make rather than cash. Maybe, I don't know how to best handle the discussion, but these organizations come from a very different position, so there has to be some flexibility as to what we look at as a contribution.
That's a good point.
Good point, Andre, thanks. Any comments on that? I have Kathy next. No? Oh, okay, you forgot to raise your hand down, that was...
I'm just learning the quickly.
No, I have the same problem. Anybody else? I don't see any hands or waves, so next is what else is...
Well, Mr. Chair, I think when we think back to the mandate of the task force, if I can just focus on that for a second. Of course, and the task force knows it's twofold. One is to oversee the development of the economic development strategy, and then the other is what we're doing right now, which is to frame out the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency and make a recommendation with respect to that framing out back to council. So I think it's we're kind of at the point where before we can move forward in putting in place the legal documents and so forth to create this corporation, we need to have some degree from the task force of comfort that what we've got here, or with some changes, and we've talked about those changes today, is kind of okay to go forward to council right now, to at least endorse some principles so the discussions can begin then around which potential shareholders may be interested and in terms of articles of incorporation and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I'm just struggling a bit here with where we go from here. I guess the first thing is, go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, and it's difficult because going with it's a great charter, and I hope it gets adopted. The awkward bit is listing off these organizations without them getting their consent beforehand, because what we're doing is we're asking the city to adopt this so you guys can go and maybe recruit them to be Class B shareholders. I think that as a step before it goes to council is a casual conversation with each of these organizations to see if we can get to a place. Otherwise, we may be back a few weeks later, council will say, well, we tried, we couldn't get anybody, so we're going to fill model. It would be nice to just have those casual conversations, maybe co-curriculum.
Okay. So with regard to funding, we had our first Finance and Audit Committee meeting this morning. And I did bring up and confirm that there is a figure of $300,000 in the 2021 budget for a Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. I clarified that was above and beyond the current Economic Development Office. So having said that, of course, that's based on what the plans as I see what we want to end up doing is probably not going to be enough to cover. I think we need to get the charter, even if it is missing a few pieces with regard to partners, approved ahead of time so we can present to council. Because I'm struggling as kind of the proponent on council for this, that, about, so how much money do we need? And I don't have an answer. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think, really it'll be once we have the economic development strategy done, and we have our work plan set out, we'll have a much better idea of what we need. So the number that I put in the budget right now was really kind of an interim low productivity number. Through the strategy itself, we might identify 2 or 3 areas that we want to put some more funding into. I don't want to presuppose what those are, but I agree, I think there needs to be more than 300,000. So I would see by the fall, when we have the strategy done, we'll actually be able to update the budget accordingly. And I think that 300 is kind of is a low placeholder at the moment.
So, yes, Debbie, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, and perhaps staff can assist, if we are happy as a task force with the revised charter, which is an intent document, and it's really in principle, if we should make a motion to forward this to council to approve in principle, and then it's kind of like the chicken or the egg, right?
No, it's a good strategy.
And then from there, once we know that council has actually approved this, then we'll be able to reach out to these organizations and ask if they wish to participate. The city would be funding 85%, is my understanding. And so the 15%, if there was 5 organizations, actually divides down to 3%. And I don't know why in my head there's like $15,000 floating around, but the 3% might not be economically, I mean, everything's a challenge economically now, but it might be doable. Do you know what approximately the 3% was looking at?
Well, the 3%, I mean, you're quite right. So the 3% comes down to, as you mentioned, Councillor Hartman, that we have 5 other owners, we got 15%, so that's 3%. The 15,000 I think you identified would be on the basis of having $500,000 in funding.
Right,
in base
okay,
funding.
yeah.
Yeah, if there were $1 million, it would be.
That's where it came from. Okay, thank you. So I'll look to see if there's more discussion or somebody else wants to move a motion.
I think Kathy,
Oh, sorry. Who's
Kathy has.
Oh, Kathy, you got your hand up, okay. Go ahead, Kathy, and then we'll go to Bob.
I know.
You need to unmute, Kathy.
Is that it?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things before, I guess you want a vote or a confirmation that the revised charter as written with the amendments that we have talked about today is what we would support to go forward to council. I would be concerned about council adopting something that hasn't been shared with potential other partners. So I would kind of tweak that recommendation. And I don't think in principle really cuts it, because in principle it's really you're adopting it or not. So if it's to accept it and then send it to the potential partners for their consideration and feedback, because in order to go to them, you'd need to have this document that shared the general guideline of how this group's going to work. So that's my comment on that. And then before we actually put our hands up to say we're happy with this, I just would like a quick summary of what changes were from today, and does that change anything that we have in the draft? Thank you.
And Jim?
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
The next council meeting that this could even get to wouldn't be until August 31st. So perhaps maybe the committee might want to take this document and take it back to their respective agencies, have it reviewed by them, we get some feedback, collate that feedback, try and incorporate it, and then move it to the August 31st meeting, because then there's some time in there.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Yeah, the other option, of course, would be to take it to council without the Class B shareholders named, just TBA. And that's another option that could work. Bob, you're next. Unless you have any further.
No, I was going to make the suggestion you just made, Mr. Chair, that it may be helpful, but I'll give you full credit for it. Yeah.
We're paying you the big bucks, so let's keep it.
That that may be, if the intent, as Councillor Martin said, is that we want to have a shared ownership model, but the concern is kind of putting off any particular group we've named because it maybe seem as presumptuous or
Yeah.
putting them in a corner, which I completely understand. It may be a case then of simply removing the names and saying the intent is to have shared ownership. You know, we'll go now and kind of, if council likes that idea, we now need to kind of identify potential owners.
I guess my point was really going to be in support of Andre's point and suggest that if we can't go to the potential shareholders first before going to council, at least given the timeframe that Karen's pointed out, maybe we can do the two together. Maybe we can get on the agenda for council, but in the month and a half in between, at least have conversations with the potential shareholders. I believe the word's out there. I don't think anybody's doubting who those potential shareholders would be at this point, so taking them off the list doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, but 6 weeks should be time for us to at least have preliminary conversations with them, I would think. So that would be my suggestion.
The only question, and I would defer to Karen on this, or Bill, is that what is the legality of releasing a task force proposal to members of the community prior to going to approval from council? Is there any issues there?
I mean, this is an open meeting. All the shareholders are on the task force.
Okay, so it's not a problem. Good.
Yeah,
So I don't.
they're all here.
Potential.
Sorry, thank you. The guys were in our.
Potential.
Big draft stamp
All
across
right,
it.
next on my speakers list is Andre, followed by Kim.
If we are trying to make this a little bit easier to swallow for the public and do want to maybe lighten the load of potential partners, or just say not limited, or have a caveat that these partners have not been yet consulted. But the other piece that is maybe problematic is the 85-15 split. That'd be great if we get there, but I wouldn't want to assume that we're successful in getting there yet. So I would probably keep it more generic and have some sort of mention of shared distributed, and hold on to that.
Okay, good point. Next we have Kim, followed by Jason.
Unless there's a price point on here to show me what the cost of ownership is going to be, there's no point in discussing this with my board, because that's going to be the first question over their mouth. What do we have to pay to play here? Because either it's going to be affordable or it's not going to be affordable, even if it is somewhat of if there can be some concessions made, considering that my budget is a small percentage of what the other four partners' budgets are. So unless I can go to my board and say this is going to mean X amount of dollars per year times 5 years, so we're making what size of commitment are we making? Otherwise, there's just no point in even asking my board about it, because it's like, how long is a piece of string is the question. Thank you.
Jason?
Yeah, I think Kim and Andre, if you're going to put the 85-15 in, it's important to have a budget value, I think, because one without the other is a little empty, as Andre said, but having some value, even a range of value, I think may be a good idea, if that's even feasible. I don't know if that's...
I think it can be, because we're dealing here just with the base funding, so we're not dealing with the project funding, which would be a separate thing. So.
The other point I will make is that at the meeting this morning, there was another figure thrown out there of $600,000 or $700,000 as the potential cost for 2021. But again, that's just a dart thrown at the board.
That's the tourism number, yeah.
Yeah, it was 600,000 for Vancouver Island tourism.
Yeah.
Well, that's tourism.
But that would be, I think the idea is that's kind of the apples.
Yeah.
That's comparing the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, who else we got here? Jolene?
Yeah, I guess for my point is kind of in support of the budget, is that 5 years is a long window, and that things escalate in price, things increase, wages increase, they may bring on more staff. So what would start today maybe as a $600,000 or $550,000 budget could easily creep and work towards a $900,000 budget as they become more robust. And to keep in mind that first contribution in year one may be an increased contribution at a percentage level as the 5 years in subsequent years head forward for terms.
Okay, thanks, Joanne, good point. I see Kathy's hand up. So, oh, Kathy's hand is down,
Yeah.
she don't want to talk, okay. Any other discussion on this point? Go ahead, Zandy, and then Bob.
I just wanted to bring up, because Kathy had said from our comments today, how is that impacting the revised charter?
Yes, no, it's a very good point, and I'm just actually furiously going through my chicken scratch here to try to give some semblance of a summary, so, which I may fail at here, but I think clearly the key bit is on the ownership and the shares, and so I think what we're getting at here as a task force is to say, look, we need to we can identify the intent of having some kind of shared ownership, which was determined to be important through our review that led to the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. The specifics on costs and stuff, we need to identify if we're going to go to particular members, but members have not yet been identified. So what have we said then with respect to going to council? Have we said going to council simply taking the names out and kind of then going forward, kind of once council is approved in principle to kind of talk with members, or?
My take on it was that we would, between now and the end of August, reach out to the potential shareholders and float the idea by them, and maybe get approval in principle from the shareholders. That would go to council on August 31st or the first week of September for draft approval, and then we would then get into that, working out the specific details after that.
And Jason.
Maybe again, it's into the weeds, sir, but if you're going to go and there's going to be a budget, what does reporting look like? How does an organization know if they're going to be putting an X dollar? What's the return? Is there some schedule of how maybe that might be drafted, or some ideas to how, when you make this investment, we would have X reports prepared, or at least some sense of ROI, like just a very broad understanding of that?
We do have on page 5 of the revised charter in there. It was in the initial one too, but let's draw attention to it. I don't think we focused on it too much last time, but it does kind of set out reporting mechanisms for that accountability. Maybe I can just, while I've just got the reporting as it were, Mr. Chair, I think that Bill and others have kind of laid out a very good idea. The only difficulty we may encounter is in the same way that council has now kind of taken August off, as it were, which it does every year. We may find the same issue with some other boards, with some other staff, because August is typically high kind of vacation time for agencies.
Yeah, like I would view the conversation at the staff level, not at the board level. So it'd be us working with the Port Authority and David, the airport, and Robin and VNU, and Kim, just having those initial conversations. And seeing if if it is thumbs up or no chance, we're not interested, no matter what, then we can let council.
Then we can let this all go.
Kim, you're next.
I have a board meeting in 2 weeks, and I don't know that I have a board meeting in August. And if I do have a board meeting in August, it'll be about 4 days before council meets. So if I want to get action on this and input feedback from my board on shared ownership, etc., I'll need to prepare something in the next 5 to 10 days so that it's in the board package for that board meeting, so that we can adequately discuss it, and my board may come back with their own set of questions around this. So I'll need that time frame before our next meeting in order to bring those questions back to you, or to submit them in advance of the meeting so that you get onto the agenda.
So I'll just, go ahead, Chris.
Is there any way to structure, thank you, Mr. Chair, is there any way to structure the Class B shareholders with a fixed annual amount so that there's some certainty over the 5 years?
That was exactly the point I was going to bring up, so carry on.
I was just going to say, to Kim's point, it's really difficult for smaller organizations or even larger organizations to say we're in at $15,000 this year, but by year 5, it could be $110,000 annually. I'm just wondering with the Class B if we can set a fixed amount so that there's certainty on an annual basis for that 5-year term.
I think that's an excellent point, but then I thought of it too. But I'll give you credit for it, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So I think these discussions are perfect on what should be happening at this table, but to be fair, I think that the 15-85 split was a suggestion, and it's worthwhile working it through to see what might work. Perhaps it turns out that 2 or 3 of the organizations can shoulder a bit more of the load than others, and I think that's the benefit of having the discussions earlier rather than later. And it's the concept that I think we're hoping to flesh out, and getting some feedback will be useful. And even if we use preliminary numbers and talk about 15% of 600,000 divided 5 ways, and that at least gets us a number to work with, and allows people to at least understand the quantum of it. So I really think it's, in the interest of getting something done, we're better off to start talking down this path sooner rather than later, my suggestion.
So how does everybody feel about, instead of a percentage, to perhaps a percentage be the initial amount, depending on what it is, and then that would remain static through the 5 years, assuming that the first amount is acceptable?
Kathy's hands up. Kathy?
Oh, Kathy, go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My only comment with that is I would say a base amount and then subject to standard inflation so that everybody can anticipate a 2% increase over the year, because if you do a 5-year budget, typically you'd be accounting for that as well. So it's not $15,000 every year, but 15 plus whatever the inflation rate for Nanaimo would be.
Fair comment. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, Mr. Chair, I just wonder if everybody's made some really good points, kind of in terms of supporting the shared ownership model, but also highlighting potential pitfalls, both in terms of the money that the different groups would be on the hook for, and the difficulties around that, but then also in terms of just simply the logistics and the sequencing of events on how to kind of get this in front of council, and how to also get it in front of other decision-making bodies so that we don't kind of get out of step. I wonder if it's kind of going a little bit over trodden ground here, but I wonder if it's something the task force to consider, to say, what if we kind of made the other changes as identified in this document, and simply kind of change this document a little bit further to say, in effect, and I'll just paraphrase here, obviously the wording will be different, but the intent of this Nanaimo Prosperity Agency model is that the city is the majority shareholder, and that we have other significant Nanaimo-based institutions that are minority shareholders in the agency. Council, that's the intent, that's what we wish to do. Can you approve in principle? After which then the task force, or city staff, but let's just say the task force for the time being, will then start to approach other agencies, and with the detailed modeling that Kim needs for his board, and that Jason needs for his board, to identify what the potential is. And the task force even could then have further discussion on what is the appropriate amount of buy-in, and do we fix that? If the intent is to get it to council on the 31st of August, then it might be the easiest way is simply to say, here's the intent, we're going to work out the details then. And if we can't get a buy-in, then the city is, the default then is the city is the sole owner, but I don't think that's the intent.
Karen?
Again, just spitballing here, what about, we could put this on as a late item for July 20th. I would just confirm that with Sheila, but I think we could put it on with something like a recommendation that the Economic Development Task Force recommend that council support in principle the draft Nanaimo Prosperity Agency draft charter, and direct staff to refer the draft charter to the proposed owners for feedback on the shares of ownership prior to final consideration. So that puts it in front of council to just get that initial support and principle. Then over the next 6 weeks or so, you can pull that information together, and when it's compiled, present it to council. You know, maybe it's in September, however long you need. That's just another option as well.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I think it's a logical option, and I like how you've laid it out. My only concern with that, moving so quickly on that, is I'm very sensitive to the points that Kim and that Jason have made with respect to feeling that they're going to be their board is going to feel that they were blindsided a little bit. And I'd be a little worried about kind of having those names in the public and then approaching them and saying, okay, you're kind of out there now. You better say yes, because if you say no, you're going to be kind of embarrassed. That's a concern I have, and so I think that would be something that I'd be a little worried about proceeding with.
So just directing staff to refer the draft document to the proposed owners for feedback initially, or?
But listing the proposed owners, I think that may be difficult if we do that in the short term.
So, through you, Mr. Chair, so what you're suggesting is under this revised charter for the shareholders, removing those names?
Leaving the intent in, exactly, that, but, and identifying that there would be other shareholders and they'd be minority class B.
And take out the names of them.
Take out the names for the time being, until we can get Kim what he needs for his board, Jason what he needs for his board, and so forth.
Kim?
Apologies.
That's all right.
Who did I miss?
Thanks, Jim. I can sell the shared ownership model to my board, I think, even though I've got a couple who are sitting on this task force right here right now. But I sell it without a price tag. I like it. I like it a lot. I think the intent is great, but I fear if we remove the names and I go to my board and they say, well, who's our partners? And I say, can't tell you or I don't know. We will very much want to know who our partners are, who our other shareholders are, because that will indicate the nature of the decision making that comes to bear. If we have 4 more private sector partners, then I'm going to have a bit different opinion of the model at that point in time. My board may have too. So I think we have to be pretty open, but pretty certain about how we're going to proceed with this. Because we're talking about a 5-year commitment, not just this is what we're going to do until next summer. We're in for the long haul. And so I think that in order for the board to form some intent around this, they need to know who the partners are, what the potential dollar amount is, and even just a range. That's, I think, the 2 most important pieces going forward on it. I do like the concept of it an awful lot.
Thanks, Kim. Andre? Oh, I'm sorry, no, Kathy first, sorry. Kathy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question. Have these documents already been a part of the public agenda? So these names are already in open?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, they are.
Well, this
Not
agenda,
broadly.
This agenda is on the website.
Is it on? Oh, okay.
This is an open meeting. It is being live streamed,
Okay.
so it is out in the public.
And it's important to remember all the people on that list are members of the task force.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So if you don't know about it, you haven't been coming to meetings.
Fair enough.
So it would just seem to me that if it's already part of the public realm, then we should just give direction or make a recommendation that these agencies be approached for consider partnership in this venture. Because if we take the names off, it's already out there in the public realm, which seems kind of, well, it doesn't make sort of logical sense, but just a comment. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Robertson's motion is actually would work quite well. Do you want to just read it again for everyone?
Okay. That the Economic Development Task Force recommend that council support in principle the draft Nanaimo Prosperity Agency draft charter and direct staff to refer the draft charter to the proposed owners for feedback on the shares and ownership prior to final consideration.
So to get this on the table, I'd like to move that motion.
Hang on, we got one more. Andre wanted to speak next.
I don't have much to say. I support the motion there. All I did want to say is whether or not the list is public or not, it is somewhat public. What we have to do is write a detailed proposal to the kids and to the other partners. Here's the cost, here's the partners, and we need to get that out pretty quick. Because that's the details, whether or not it's on an agenda or it gets in front of council. I think we all know who the partners are. We've got an idea of the cost. And so maybe we don't want floating around the council meeting, but we want it on paper for the partners.
Fair enough. Okay. If you're making a motion, Jason might have, is it to do with a potential motion, or do you want?
No, go ahead.
Was nobody's, did you second?
I'll second it.
Mr. Moss second.
Okay, go ahead. So we need the motion read to...
Oh, it's Karen's motion.
I'm putting together your thoughts.
Okay.
It's something that we can look at.
That's a real challenge for me.
So speaking to the motion, it's about moving this along. It's about getting this revised charter in front of City Council in the meantime, for the end of August. In the meantime, we will be approaching and speaking with the agencies that are potentially involved with the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency.
A little tweak, it would be proposed to go on the 27th meeting so that you've got the month of August to collect that feedback.
27th of
So it'll be the
July?
27th of July.
Oh, okay.
And then you've got the entire month of August to collect that feedback. And the only other clarification I was hearing from the group, the concern about shares and ownership, but maybe you want to remove that out and just have owners on feedback on the document generally in case there's any other issues as well. Or do you want to keep the words just focusing in on shares and ownership?
Jason, go ahead.
I just don't want to get caught up, and I understand the names have been released, we know who's on the task force, but I think when we talked about the names being released, it was done under an assumption that those partners, that was done by yourself in the last discussion. So I just want to make sure our board has some idea of this. Obviously, we understand what's going on. The language needs to be clear that it's just exploration, right? And I think that's important.
Yeah, because it's prior to final consideration that the feedback would be brought back to this group, just prior to going to council again.
So the only question I would have is kind of the cart before the horse scenario. Is there a desired rush to have it presented to council on the 27th prior to when we've had an opportunity to speak to volunteer, hopefully, or at least proposed shareholders, with maybe it should be the other way around when...
I prefer August, myself, August 3rd, to give us an opportunity to internally digest what's here now and what's being revised, sort of.
Yeah.
In the motion, it didn't have a date.
Yeah, she did.
It didn't have a specified date.
No, it didn't.
Oh, it didn't? Oh, okay.
So it
No, I was
looks
just
like
thinking you wanted it to get to council so they were aware of it and also to give that direction to staff to circulate the document, but that can still be done regardless of whether it's August or July.
Yeah.
Okay. I correct myself.
We'll keep working regardless.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have discussion on this motion? I don't see any little blue hands are waving. Oh, I see waving. Andre, go ahead.
Just a comment that I think we get as council sooner, and then we engage the partners formally. And if we keep this first approach to council saying that the partners have not been approached, they're not on board, and we don't want to disclose it at this time, but we'll be coming back to you fall. But I'd like to see it go earlier. I don't think it precludes us from talking to the groups. We don't have to get those groups on board before it goes to council.
Okay. Difference of opinion here.
The motion actually doesn't state which way.
Well, I think the motion is just getting it in front of council to to give direction to just support in principle, but also by putting it to council, you're directing staff to refer the draft charter to the proposed owners for feedback prior to final consideration. So it's just giving that direction now to circulate the
staff can
document.
go out.
Exactly, and then, once the feedback has been compiled and considered by this group again, sometime in late August or beginning of September, you would finalize that before it would go to council for final.
So more clarification for Jason's sake. So if we went before the July 27th, strictly as a approval in principle, that still will give the time for staff to then communicate with the various agencies.
Yeah, because the last
Prior
part
to
of
any final decisions.
correct, because that's what the end of that motion states, is that you're giving that direction to get the feedback from the owners prior to final consideration.
Okay.
So it's basically more of a report for information to council as opposed to...
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm just
Go ahead, Jason.
wondering why does it need to be approved in principle at this stage? Is it just received, you're going to get the minutes anyway, council, received the status update, this is the direction it's going, it's being referred for feedback from the artists, do the members, would the members prefer agreement in principle so that they know where council stands, but they're going to want to know where the member or the stakeholders, shareholders stand, so it's, I'm not sure council will be in a position to give principal approval when they haven't really heard the feedback from the people that are actually going to stand in and be part of this. So it's this cart and horse scenario, so it's pick your poison, I guess, or pleasure. So, well, it could be received and say, directing staff to refer it for formal comment from those stakeholder groups would be one option. In that way, doesn't, or does the group feel that it would prefer to have a solid feeling from council, but they haven't had the briefing that you've been going through, so it's just how much solid ground you feel you want to be on before you get it referred to you and then referred back is sort of the question. Or is it still subject, I mean, to be honest, it's still subject to feedback anyway, regardless. What if there's feedback that's contrary to the principle? It's how much flexibility is there in the principle?
We're going to try a stab at another one, based on Mr. Rudolph's
For the meantime, just to go, I'll withdraw, if it's okay with Mr. Moss, I'll withdraw that motion for now.
Well, given that it leaves some latitude there, do we need to withdraw it? Because I thought it had...
It did have latitude.
You can make them, you can do it a couple of ways. You could withdraw it if you wanted, but you could also just amend it to be receive the draft Nanaimo Prosperity Agency draft charter for information and direct staff and carry on. You can just make that amendment. So it's either support in principle
I'd be okay with that. If you're
Okay, I'm okay with that. Oops.
Good. I think it's really,
Table work.
if I may,
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I think it's really important to keep council on side with this as it's moving forward, because I mean, many of them will know anyway, but I think we really should try and keep everybody in the loop while we're trying to make progress with it.
Any other input on this? Questions, comments? I don't see any hands or blue hands going up.
Could you reread that? Sorry.
What's that?
Apologies. Could you reread that?
Okay, so the new proposed motion would be that the Economic Development Task Force recommend that council receive the draft Nanaimo Prosperity Agency draft charter for information and direct staff to refer the draft charter to the proposed owners for feedback prior to final consideration.
Does that work? Okay.
I know.
It's only taken us 20 minutes. What do we got? I assume we're going to vote. Okay, so all in favor? 1, 2, 3, opposed?
Abstained, if I may.
Carried.
Who's opposed?
Nobody.
Nobody?
I
Oh,
didn't see anybody.
okay.
Let Jolene's hand up.
And you
Oh, Jolene,
Oh,
yeah?
Jolene.
Jolene, are you in favor or opposed?
I don't know who hands hands up, I'm in favor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Don't ask Doug. Do not put your hand up, Doug.
And Doug is not voting, he's just listening.
Doug's on the
He's
motorcycle.
Okay, that's a time we got. Well, we got another 15 minutes yet.
You don't have to do this.
You don't have to use
Is there anything else that we should potentially be discussing? I'm almost free.
Yeah, there are.
Exactly, let's get out of here before we change our mind. I think, Mr. Chair, that it's, and Kathy made this point earlier in saying, what are the changes we've talked about through the text. I'd like to, if I could, just kind of confer with Bill and Karen and just kind of get a sense of what we've kind of heard, and we'll need to make a few stabs at it, but as it's going forward as an information item, it doesn't preclude us from having to make changes on specifics a little bit later. But I think between amongst the three of us, we can capture the key items that came forward, and hopefully come up with a second or the third version that reflects what we think is the consensus on some of the specific points other than the shared ownership model.
So the other point, and I may be out of order here, but that we need to be considering, in my opinion, sooner than later, is what the strategies are, kind of costs, that type of thing, to keep us moving forward, as opposed to, we've had a lengthy discussion today, and I'm quite satisfied that hopefully we have decided that it's acceptable. But I guess the next step is what we got to, and I don't know what that step would be, so.
Yeah, so, thanks, Chair. So the strategy work is continuing. So we have Lionsgate Consulting doing that. You remember we had the focus groups back in June.
Yeah.
So they're just, the business survey that Kim and others have helped promote, that closes this Friday.
Okay.
So certainly encourage everyone on the task force, if you yourself have not done the survey, or if you have colleagues out there, please encourage them to complete that business survey. That information will go into Lionsgate's Stage 1 report, which essentially lays out the current state of Nanaimo and the issues. And then the goal is in early September, they'll be working on starting to draft out some of the key areas, and they're going to have a workshop with the task force and potentially some other stakeholders to start drafting the strategy. So early September, we'll be getting into the strategy and the actions with the goal of hopefully wrapping that up in October. So I think we're doing well in terms of timing, in terms of trying to meet our mandate of being done around October. So I think at the moment we're on track.
Okay, perfect. That was the answer I was looking for. Is there any other, yes, Bob?
So, Jim, just for the purposes of discussion, does it make sense to talk about a budget for year one of $600,000 to $700,000 as a range? I mean, is that in the ballpark? I'm looking at Bill here. It seems to me that it's something like that. It's not $2 million. It's likely not $1 million. So.
I think the budgeting process would involve determining the overhead costs, because it is being determined, as somewhere on here was indicated, that the office would be not City Hall, it would be somewhere else. So obviously rent, unless we can find a generous landlord who would provide it. Obviously, possibly an executive director. So 300 might be, for the year, I think might be pushing it a bit, more than a bit.
So we do have funding in this year's budget to get started. So again, we have $300,000 for this year as well. So that would give us a chance to, if there are startup costs with getting a facility operational, there's money from in this year's budget as well to do that.
And I would assume that if we don't spend the full 300 for the remainder of the year, that it would carry forward. No, it goes back into.
Wherever it goes back to, we'll get it out.
Finance would not let that happen.
That's the federal government.
Kathy?
I swear she had it up.
Mr. Chair, just a little bit on our city council budget process. So we're starting on that now. We have identified that there could be a cost center around this subject, and it's presented to council as an item that's coming. The council itself will be faced with making decisions on budget the first go of decisions until late November. At that time, hopefully we'll have it set. There's a lot of COVID information that has to be sorted out through this, but that would be the latest. We need to have certainty around the implementation strategy plan for this governance structure and implementation of the strat plan, whether it's all in phase 1 or 2 or so. But the sooner you get to a point where you've got some certainty around an action plan and resources to deliver on that for next year, better from a budgeting point of view. But so the council will be receiving business plans in probably November, and then making decisions on that late November, early December, probably late November with our schedule. So that just kind of gives you the bookend on the outside of this in terms of having decisions around, or recommendations or ideas around budgeting.
I'm not sure if...
Yeah, I'm just going to say, did everybody hear Mr. Rudolph?
Oh, Chris did.
Oh, okay, everybody heard, perfect, good.
Oh.
Karen?
So just in terms of timing on that then, just for clarity, this will go to the July 27th meeting for council to receive this and provide that direction. Would the respective agencies be able to review this within, say, by the 1st of September, the 4th of September in that area, in order to have a task force meeting at the beginning of September prior to going to council?
Well, I think Kim already indicated that his board meeting in August would be like 4 days before.
I don't think we could get this specific item back to the task force until probably end of September. I think
End of September,
Just have to be
okay.
realistic
Yeah.
with people's board schedules, etc.
Okay, yeah.
I think it'd be great to be able to start having the conversation at the staff level, providing the necessary documents so things could go to the boards in early September, whenever. Yeah.
Okay, any other comments, questions? No? Any other business we need to deal with? I don't think there is.
Move for adjournment.
So, a seconder on the adjournment.
Everybody wants to stay.
Four hands went up. Chris Beaton, you're not on the minutes, so we'll give you the seconder. All in favor? Carried. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And thanks everybody for your time.